Welcome back, everyone. It's Tuesday, November 24th. This is our only class this week. As you all know, it is the week of Thanksgiving, so we're not going to be meeting on Thursday. And then, of course, next week is our final week of this class with you together, and that is really kind of unbelievable to both Alan and myself that we're already here. So these final presentations are obviously deeply meaningful for us since it's been an incredible journey with you all. And today is, I think, going to be a fascinating discussion about urban design and cities in the wake of COVID-19. Before we get an opportunity to introduce our wonderful speakers, I just wanted to recognize this week brings up a lot for a lot of people. Some of you may be traveling, some of you may be having loved ones come to visit, and others may not be able to be connected with your loved ones during this time. It's a deeply challenging time because of this pandemic, and we want to recognize that and understand that inherent in this moment also brings up all of these deep challenges that we've discussed throughout the course of isolation and loneliness. And we recognize for many of you, this is going to be a time that's particularly challenging. And so, our hearts are with all of you. We also think this is, a time to reflect on where we are as individuals, but also in this group collective. And today really reflects that larger ethos of how we live together and what our spaces are like, both in the United States and also we're going to have a global perspective. And I think that's really critical to this dialogue. And to lead in from the class we had last week on the arts, there was a real recognition that we come together as a community to come and visualize the arts, particularly in urban areas, whether it's going to museums or going to live performances. And of course, living together in densely populated spaces has large impacts. So for example, early on in the pandemic, New York City was the city that was hit the hardest. Obviously, that has changed significantly now during this time. But again, conceptualizing how we live together. I know as a physician at the Brigham, what we were seeing early on was the transmission within households, and particularly low-income households where a lot of people were living in tight spaces together, many of whom were frontline workers. And so there's a lot of the complexities that we are looking forward to unpacking today about how we live together, how we coexist together, and again, what defines us and our humanity. So we're really thrilled to have 4 phenomenal speakers today. Our first speaker is teaching at the same time, so she has generously taped her talk. So we'll be hearing from her remotely, but we'll still introduce her. And then we have 3 live speakers today. So I'm going to hand it over to Alan to introduce our wonderful speakers.
Thanks, Ingrid. Ingrid and I have really been looking forward to today's session. And I have to say, personally, as a historian of medicine, the history of cities and the history of disease are fundamentally interconnected. And the debates about cities going far back in time often centered on the problem of cities and contagion, cities and disease, and how people could live together in dense situations and try to moderate the risks of disease and often death. And so it's been quite striking as a historian to see the reemergence of fundamental considerations about how we live in cities, the issues of inequality, the issues of inequalities in health, racism, the way cities are structured, and of course their infrastructure, which has been a crucial issue of being able to maintain and sustain cities in the 20th and now the 21st century. So we've really brought together some exceptional guest faculty today who have worked on cities and in cities from a variety of disciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives to think through with us the impact and the meaning of COVID-19 now as we try to address the pandemic, but especially as we look forward in terms of the future of urban life and the recovery of cities and how they will look and how we will want to develop cities in the future that address some of the fundamental fault lines in society that we've talked so much about in the course. So our first speaker is Professor Ann Forsyth, and as Ingrid mentioned, she'll be talking on a videotape because she is simultaneously teaching a course at the Graduate School of Design on COVID and urban planning. Her work has focused on the relationship of public and private spaces, of health in cities and city design, and she's written a great deal about aging and planned communities, which is obviously also relevant to issues in the pandemic. Our second speaker will be Professor Edward Glaeser, who is a member of our economics department, and he has written about microeconomic theory, but also urban and public economies. He's been especially interested in how cities function as sources of ideas transmission and culture, and he's an expert on the relationship of economics to urban experience, urban design, and thinking about the future of cities more broadly. Our third speaker is an active architect and urban designer, as well as a faculty member at our Graduate School of Design, Stephen Gray. And he has focused significantly on problems of justice and social equality as they are framed in our built and our broader urban environments, how to address problems of racism and social injustice through structures and especially housing. And he is the founder of a firm that's based in Boston called Grayscale Collaborative. And it's really great to have him here too. Finally, our fourth speaker, it works at the World Bank. He's a doctoral graduate from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Sameh Waba. And Dr. Waba's been working through the World Bank to reconsider how cities recover from disasters and how they can be strengthened in terms of their resilience and their inclusiveness. And it's really great to welcome him here today. His most recent work at the World Bank has centered attention on recovery of cities from COVID-19 and how they can be structured in more effective ways to reduce risk and promote sustainability. So it's a really fantastic group of speakers, and we'll start with Professor Forsyth's video, and then we'll have our other three live speakers today.
Hello, I'm Ann Forsyth from the Graduate School of Design, and I do research in the area of healthy places. My role in this class session is to ask, can COVID-19 help focus attention on creating healthier cities and communities in a comprehensive sense, combining environments and policies across sectors? First, I'm going to look at some of the experimentation which has and has not happened in the pandemic. And second, I'm going to look at paths forward. Both parts really say the same thing, that smaller changes are more likely, and a really comprehensive approach is really difficult to pull off. So now hopefully you know the main responses to the pandemic are to do with practices like mask wearing or testing and tracing, but the environment has or could play a role. There's been a lot of experimentation, like helping pedestrians social distance with pop-up shared streets, helping people find alternatives to transit through temporary bike networks, or new kinds of public participation to reduce the digital divide. These small-scale solutions come from a menu of things people were already trying, now being brought to scale. There's a lot of this kind of experimentation, and I think some of this will stick around. More difficult is rethinking larger sectors because here things get more expensive. For instance, making housing healthier could mean increasing affordable housing at a policy level, something people have struggled to do across the world for decades. In design terms, even something simple like adding easier access to outdoors, things like private balconies or patios, can be seen as a luxury in affordable and low-cost housing, in spite of how useful it would have been in the pandemic. While workplaces are being rethought, this raises issues of health and safety for those who can work at home, equity issues for others, and overall will require a more ubiquitous digital access than many countries have. So sectoral innovations could make a big difference in health and well-being, but take resources, and the changes more related to urban and planning and design, rather than something like logistics, can be quite challenging. But most difficult will be comprehensive approaches. Programs such as the WHO Healthy Cities program or age-friendly communities have been around for a while now, and they do lots of things right. They include healthy built environments that protect from harmful exposures. They connect people to the resources they need to live a healthy life, and they can provide supports for healthy behaviors like getting out into the outdoors. They include cross-sector collaborations, bringing together government, business, education, and community sectors. And they can address chronic diseases, which are the big killers still, as well as infectious ones. They also have an equity focus, which is quite important. The tricky issue is that their results have often been underwhelming in spite of some exemplars. They seem to be too often fighting for money and attention. Now, I actually am not saying that we need programs called Healthy Cities, but something that uses health and well-being as a lens to shape the built and institutional environment could make a difference. A health-oriented, participatory, metropolitan green kind of vision, perhaps. The image here shows this tension, a truly exemplary eco-city development that yet struggles with affordability. So what about the future? Well, I'm going to talk about 4 options for the paths forward, and they come from having looked at how difficult it is to make changes to create comprehensive healthy places. First of all, is forgetting. It actually could be the case that societies don't learn very much. People suffer through the pandemic, are relieved about getting to the end, and then go back to a variation of normal. This often happens with recessions. There are a lot of other things happening in the world to capture attention, and it could be that this case people see vaccines as given us a medical solution, and so a sort of healthy cities approach is not so important. Path 2 is pandemic preparedness, classic public health. Many societies will learn how to do much better public health surveillance with better early warning and quicker responses. It won't be unthinkable to shut down next time or do the equivalent of mask wearing. And while the next pandemic will not be the same, there are only so many potential types of pandemics and people can be ready. This is the story of the places that had faced SARS and MERS, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and so on. They've done much better this time, and more places will be like that. But this is more related to institutions and social practices, not so much places. This may be fine. And the first slide showed Hong Kong, and which has a sort of a dense, active, vibrant built environment where mask wearing has really made a big difference. Path 3, I call lifestyle shifts, although that's not a great title. And what it does is it adds to path 2, preparedness, some more institutional responses and modest environmental changes. The world's now experimented with some new ways of working, innovations in public space, flexibility in delivering education, and alternative travel. Some of these are a big deal, like work from home and not traveling. Though in terms of health, it's actually hard to know quite what they'll do. And on average, they may not make that much difference for things like chronic diseases, which are the big killers and the place where environments have the most effects. They will have health effects, but it may be occupational health and safety, other areas like that. So there might be big changes in the world, and even for cities and communities, but not necessarily big changes for health, or in particular for the connection between health and place. Part 4 is a healthy communities approach that leads to a substantial reorientation of cities and communities to engage health across a lot of domains. The classic healthy city, though, in an environment where many people have really lived through a life-changing experience. People have had to pull together for a health goal, collaborate across sectors, cooperate in society, and this could continue. Many people from across all domains have seen how chronic diseases exacerbate problems and how important environmental supports are, like affordable housing, accessible open space, better transportation options, robust food systems, and so on. There have been a lot of attempts at healthy cities and healthy versions of sustainable and resilient cities since the 80s, and maybe this is the time they'll take off. But of course, it was hard to do healthy communities in the past because it requires collaboration across sectors, a commitment to using evidence while also engaging the public, addressing health equity, which is always a challenge because it includes issues of power and economics, and a real reorientation to engaging long-term health concerns, not just a crisis response. I honestly think parts 1, 2, and 3 are most likely, but the healthy communities approach, path 4, may be possible in a few places. Perhaps it really is a new moment.
Well, I want to thank Professor Forsyth. Her talk raises many issues for our following 3 speakers, especially when in some ways we think about infrastructural changes in cities that have historically made them safer, like sewers and roads and many things that really were characterized by the late 19th, early 20th century, and raises this question that perhaps we're going to go through a new phase where we really rethink infrastructure again. But on that note, let me introduce Professor Glaeser for his presentation.
Thank you. Let me just bring this up. Great. And slideshow from, I'm very happy to be here, happy to be in this class, and happy to talk about cities. For those of you who want more of an economic approach to cities, I will be teaching the economics of cities at 1800 next semester, and I'd love to see as many of you as possible there. This painting, which is The Plague of Ashdod by Nicolas Poussin, is often associated with the Plague of Athens, which is our first well-recorded urban plague. Thucydides was there and he wrote about it. And the Plague of Athens, of course, highlights the sort of essentially joined nature between mass contagion and urban life. The backstory was that Pericles' strategy during the Peloponnesian War was to summon his Athenian compatriots within the walls of Athens and trust to those walls to defeat the Spartan hoplites. At the same time, he sent forth the Athenian navy to attack the shores of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. That strategy worked perfectly well militarily, but the walls could not protect against disease, against the disease that came in through the port of Piraeus and really laid waste to the city. This was a city which in the decades before the Peloponnesian War had really shown all that cities can possibly do, had shown the ability of cities to create democracy, to create culture, to create history, to create a sort of a whole new world that has continued to shape us through collaborative chains of creativity. And yet here was a city that was laid low through contagion. And it really reminds us that there are many demons that come with density: crime, high housing costs, traffic congestion. But the most terrible of these diseases is the fact that if 2 people are close enough to give each other an idea face to face, they're also close enough to pass along a virus. Now, over the last 2,400 years since that moment, we've had many experiences with urban plagues. Perhaps the most terrible of those was the plague of Justinian in 541 CE, when that Roman emperor's hope of reimposing the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean world was really completely derailed by the first appearance of Yersinia pestis on European shores in Constantinople in 541. And at that moment, in some sense, the possibility of new order of an urban civilization being reimposed on Europe really vanished. And we had, perhaps because of the plague, 7 centuries of rural poverty and political chaos. But since 1340, since the reappearance of the Black Death, we've proven to be more resilient. And in some sense, the urban reboot after the Middle Ages really was one in which disease was constantly part of life. This shows the progression of death rates in New York during the 19th century, when plague after plague brought on seafaring ships, these things would come from across the oceans. Yellow fever probably originated in Africa, carried through the Caribbean, made its way to the seaports of the eastern seaboard in the 1790s. Then, of course, cholera, which probably mutated on or about 1817 in the Ganges Delta, and then made its way through different trade routes, eventually making it to New York in 1832. Now, these urban plagues didn't disappear on their own. They required a combination of massive investments in infrastructure and incentives. Okay, and the infrastructure that's most important here was sewers and clean water. And America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water and sewers at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. We spent an extraordinary amount on this infrastructure. And we may well want to be spending an extraordinary amount to make sure that this current pandemic never happens again. The second thing that I want to highlight, though, is that I was raised on a tale of engineering triumphalism, that New York had been filthy, and then the good engineers built the Croton Aqueduct, and then the clean waters came in and New York was healthy. But this picture, puts the lie to that story. As you can tell, the Croton Aqueduct opened in 1842, and New York City is still having cholera epidemics 24 years after this one. In fact, my great-great-great-grandfather died in the 1849 cholera epidemic in New York, 7 years after Croton. The reason was, of course, the last mile problem, which is a problem that those of us who work on water and sub-Saharan Africa still face today. You built the aqueduct, you built sewer lines, and poor people weren't willing to pay for the connection. Understandably, they were poor, as they still are today, but consequently, they continue to use their pit latrines, they continue to use their shallow wells, and they continue to get cholera and to die. It wasn't until you had the remarkable Dr. Stephen Smith, who led the Board of Health at its opening and started imposing fines on tenement owners who didn't connect to the water system, that you started to solve this problem. And it reminds you that you need both incentives, you need rules, as well as just providing infrastructure. Now, we have lived a blessed century since the influenza epidemic, in which very few urban plagues, with the possible exception of AIDS, have struck at our cities. And consequently, we have in some sense gotten used to the idea that we can live close to one another without putting ourselves at risk. We have forgotten the fact that even in 1900, a boy born in New York City could expect to live 6 years less than a boy born in rural America. But now we are once again facing an urban plague. A couple of points that I want to make about the health data on this, and this comes from work that I've done with Stephen Redding and Caitlin Gorbach on New York City during the months of April and March. This shows cases per capita and changes in trips. The first thing to notice is that the cases were actually lowest in the parts of New York that are actually densest. So it's not as if high-rise housing dwellings are necessarily a recipe for death. What is a recipe for death is human connection in an unprotected way during the time of a pandemic. And what you can see is that the places that had the fewest cases were also the places that reduced their trips. This was itself a reflection of privilege. This was a self-effect of the fact that these places were richer. They had more educated inhabitants who found it easier to switch to remotable work. And in fact, our estimates, which use as a sort of statistical tool the pre-existing industrial mix, and you can see here the relationship between the change in trips and COVID cases across New York City zip codes, we found that about a 10% reduction in trips during those key months of March and April was associated with a 20% reduction in COVID cases. And again, when we look at data in India and in Brazil, it's not about population density, it's about the share of people living in slums, it's about the share of people living in favelas. And just last week, the IFDC in India, the work of Anup Malani and his co-authors, has shown us that the serological data in Karnataka slums suggests 50% rates have already happened. We're already closing in on perhaps herd immunity in these very high density, highly crowded areas of urban India. Now, this, of course, is not just a health disaster, it is also an economic disaster. And in some sense, the economic evolution of our world has made us maximally vulnerable to this kind of face-to-face pandemic. When we worked on farmers, when we were subsistence farmers in the Middle Ages, a massive plague like the Black Death actually left the remnants richer. In some sense, wealth is about land per capita, and with a smaller number of people, that means you're richer. The urban industrial world of the late 19th, early 20th century was one in which the products could still be sold if there was indeed still a threat of disease. The switch from wool to cotton actually made it easier to ship goods without fear of infection because you would heat the cotton products afterwards. And of course, cars are not likely to be a source of contagion if they're shipped over space. So the short, sharp recession that we saw from the influenza pandemic was very real, but it was over very quickly. By contrast, over the past 50 years, as automation, as outsourcing have eliminated these factory jobs, workers have found a safe harbor in urban service jobs, in the ability to serve a latte with a smile, and yet those jobs can vanish in a heartbeat when that smile becomes a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. And that is indeed exactly what we've seen are particularly these jobs which provided less educated Americans with some form of opportunity have been the most vulnerable, either to losing their jobs or to economic disaster. This comes from work I did with a series of co-authors on measuring small business closures. This was around April. We continued to do it for months afterwards. We were amazed by the level of carnage in our small business ecosystem. 45% of the small businesses in our sample were closed. And of course, there was a huge range, only 19% in banking and finance, up to 70% in arts and entertainment. Amazingly, huge numbers still expected to be closed as of December. And I guess that's just around the corner. So we'll see whether or not they end up being right. 37% expected to still be closed in December. And out of those, there was, let's say 42% in arts and entertainment. One more point I want to talk about. One of the things that cities face going forward is the question of whether or not this switch to remotable work will remain permanent. This comes from the change that we've seen in mobility, going to workplaces, using cell phone data. This shows 5 different countries, and indeed the substantial decline in the number of people going to work. In May 2020, about 50 million Americans had switched to teleworking, had switched to remote work, and about 50 million Americans had lost their job due to COVID. But importantly, those populations are very different. The share that had lost their jobs was somewhat equally distributed across the education distribution, except for the fact that educated people were somewhat more secure. So only 14% of people with advanced degrees had lost their job because of COVID, as opposed to 20% of people with less than a high school diploma. But the inequality among teleworking is even more extreme. There we have only 5.2% of high school dropouts were teleworking due to the pandemic, and 70%, 68.9% of people with advanced degrees were telecommuting due to COVID, right? An enormous divide, which has been true for most of our technological innovations over the past 50 years, is that it has played to the advantages of the skilled, not to the less skilled. And indeed, a future in which teleworking remains a permanent part of our life is likely to be one that is even more inequitable than the last few decades. We asked small business owners, we asked business economists, members of NABE, what they expected going forward. About 40% of business owners projected that 40% or more of their workers who switched would stay switched. Okay, so that's something like a population switch of about 10 million workers, likely to be a fairly big hit for urban commercial real estate markets. But there is at least some of a bright light in the sense that people don't seem to be hiring people for remotable jobs. I don't know that that's a bright light, but there is at least a hypothesis that those of us who are working remotely are sort of coasting on fumes. We're coasting on relationships that we built during a face-to-face stage. And consequently, people aren't hiring new workers to come in just to be remote. That's what we see from this. So the red lines show the change in employment for not remotable jobs, big drop in employment, but then it came back, and you see hirings in blue also coming back. In terms of employment, the employment for remotable jobs much more stable, but the new hirings have dropped and have stayed dropped, right? And in some sense, the remotable jobs feel like they're both harder to bring into a new corporate culture, to a new business culture, harder to train, and harder to actually build a non-transactional emotional relationship with. And for 40 years, I have opined that the cyberseers and the technoprophets who predicted that IT would kill off cities and the face-to-face contact that cities enable were wrong. I still think that they're largely wrong. That face-to-face contact is special. It is special to teach in the same class. It is special to be in the same room, and it's much more fun. I will just end. I think there are 2 paths forward. If this pandemic continues for years, if the vaccines don't pan out, if we get a second pandemic within the next 5 to 10 years, the shock to our urban world will be quite dramatic. It will also be absolutely catastrophic for the entire urban service economy. That's 32 million American workers who work in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade jobs that will be clobbered by any persistent pandemic risk. But if it ends quickly, right, we will still see major shocks. So just to run through what you should expect. prices will drop more than vacancies will rise, okay? The price mechanism can move more quickly. Owners of commercial real estate will drop their prices, which will induce more people to come back into the space. Commercial space will likely be more vulnerable than residential. One thing we've seen clear is that even if people can work remotely, it is so much less fun. And as soon as you allow particularly younger people to get back together, to connect with each other, to commune in an urban space, they run to it. And I believe that ultimate demand for face-to-face connection in cities will make sure that our urban spaces remain resilient. Cities will reallocate from the old, who are more fearful, to the young, who are more hungry for social connection. Some significant work will move to homes or to lower density, what I call consumer cities, places that are pleasant to live in, the Vales, the Boulders, places that are able to offer something that is a higher quality of life and enable you to, let's say, zoom in to your Silicon Valley location. Finally, of course, international travel and tourism, which have been a mainstay of urban economies for decades, will surely be depressed for quite some time. And public transportation is very, very vulnerable. So even in the good case scenario, it is going to be a bumpy ride for the next 5 years for cities. But for the past 2,500 years, since Socrates and Plato were bickering on an Athenian street corner, cities have been doing miraculous things, and the age of urban miracles is not done. Let me stop there.
Thanks so much. We're always pleased in this course when somebody has a potentially optimistic view of the future, because we've all been living through such a hard time. Your talk, Professor Glaeser, resonates with many things we've heard in the course. About 2 weeks ago, we had a session on telehealth, and it was very interesting because telehealth has actually worked out fairly well for people who already had established relationships with their caregiver, but has been much more highly problematic to introduce. And your notion that companies, that transform to remote, people who are already working there, but it's been harder to introduce people into industries. And there were many other aspects that I think tie in with this whole notion of what the world will look like in the future. I've observed in this course that all of us regret being fully remote, but the legacies of this remote phase and hybrid aspects seem to me to be characteristic of where we might go in a lot of different educational settings. The irony of this course was that Ingrid and I were able to bring so many, exceptional people to the course, and to sort of leverage this moment to have sessions like this. So it makes me think that you're right. The last thing I'll say just very quickly is we know when the pandemic began, roughly last December and January, certainly in the United States by February in an intensive way. But how the pandemic we know will end seems to be one of the really complicated stories that we are talking about now, because things will return at very erratic and different paces, and how we think about those returns and recovery will happen in many different industries, activities, engagements at a very different pace in different ways. So people often ask historians, well, when did this epidemic end? And the answer is usually that, well, it didn't exactly end. And it persists in some ways, and it changes the way we think and work and live. So on that note, let me introduce Stephen Gray to talk about some of the things he's been thinking about, because both your presentation and Professor Forsyth raised this issue. Well, will we just find ways of pasting things back together again? Or can the pandemic be used in some transformational way about how we think about cities and buildings and the built environment? So, Professor Gray.
Well, thank you for having me. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right. So my talk is called Designing for Shared Power, Advancing Racial Equity in Post-COVID America. We are currently experiencing two colliding public health emergencies, COVID-19 and systemic racism. Both have public health, public policy, and urban design implications, and both are overwhelmingly harming or killing people of color. But this was not unavoidable. While it's true that the coronavirus does not discriminate by race, where it is lacking in racial bias, the United States has made up for with a resilient and highly adaptive white supremacist capitalist racial ideology. This has justified spatial and economic exclusion through segregation and redlining, racial terrorism through Jim Crow laws and community massacres, community theft through blockbusting and predatory lending, targeted community removal through urban renewal and federal highway programs, the criminalization of Blackness and loss of voting rights and citizenship through mass incarceration and deportation, or simply blanket ethnic exclusion. And as a result, urban resources have concentrated in some places and cities and marginalized communities in others. But many planners, designers, and policymakers still operate with an economic impact imperative, ignoring the very real social implications, good, bad, or otherwise, that our decisions and designs will have for society. So what we need to do to address social inequities in cities today is to acknowledge the intersectionality of race, class, the production of space, and health, interrogate our contribution to and complicity with structural and infrastructural racism, and develop methodologies and interventions to address issues of racial injustice. So how did American cities get so divided? During post-World War II era, two migratory movement patterns collided. First, white flight saw white Americans moving to the suburbs, motivated by the promise of a better life and fueled by federally insured mortgage lending that chiefly benefited white veterans and steered them away from red-lined inner city neighborhoods, which were predominantly Black. And second was a mid-20th century peak in the Great Migration of Black Americans moving north and west to escape racist Jim Crow laws of the Deep South and pursue economic opportunity. And while the dominant narrative was and still is in many ways that everyone was leaving cities for the suburbs, which is why we needed to build highways and why we needed urban renewal programs, if you actually look more closely at the changes in the Black population in city centers, it was growing exponentially during those periods. But as white population left, and with them the local tax base, national programs that promised to connect and rebuild crumbling urban cores instead systematically dismantled them, in the process disproportionately harming immigrants and people of color. And between 1950 and 1980, predominantly, federally funded highway and urban renewal projects swept through US cities. In addition, redlining maps pushed communities of color into smaller and smaller areas. These programs, designed primarily to respond to urban neglect, instead concentrated those who settled in segregated inner city neighborhoods, primarily immigrants and people of color, in wedge-shaped areas where many Black Americans and immigrants live today. And you can see in Boston, where the concentration of our majority minority city population, the majority of those minorities live within that wedge-shaped area. Experiencing dramatic disparities in wealth, educational attainment, and life expectancy, as well as below average access to jobs, open space, and public transportation. And one example of a health outcome is that life expectancy in the neighborhood of Back Bay is 92 compared to Roxbury, where it is 58. The COVID-19 pandemic has had the most devastating impacts on communities of color, as illustrated by this map showing the areas of Boston with the highest COVID-19 infection rates, which also exactly traces that wedge-shaped area of Boston where most of the people of color are concentrated. The pandemic has heightened our societal need for and use of high-quality parks and outdoor spaces. And while elected officials love to say things like every resident lives within a 10-minute walk of a park, as is commonly said in Boston, we intuitively know that not all parks are created equally in size, quality, or programmatic offerings. For instance, parks in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan are significantly less in number and smaller in scale. And so the communities that need public spaces the most during this pandemic are the least well served. And so you can see the green are the parks, the salmon color is the 5-minute walk, and then the light yellow is the 10-minute walk. And you can see those neighborhoods again within that wedge, which have been systematically overlooked. So the focus of my research and practice is on spatializing and rectifying social and ultimately health inequities through processes of radical inclusion and design intermediation. This means redistributing resources into under-resourced communities, redistributing opportunities for those under-resourced communities in the highly resourced parts of cities, and redistributing power. So here are two examples of what shared power and shared space can look like for cities. In American cities, strongly delineated color lines still separate white residents from residents of color. And 10 years ago, Boston Seaport looked like this. And it was hailed as the last major opportunity to build a neighborhood that reflects Boston's rich cultural diversity. Instead, we built the most economically and racially exclusive neighborhood in the city. And while Boston officially became a majority-minority city in 2010, our newest downtown neighborhood is 89% white. Led by private real estate developers, it caters disproportionately to white residents and visitors. So how do we design for racial and cultural inclusion in elite spaces that are driven by capital? On the left-hand side are real headlines about the seaport, and on the right are kind of the headlines we want to see. And this was a quick mock-up we did for the Massachusetts Port Authority, working with them to rethink their public realm to be more inclusive and racially diverse. And so as you can see, economic development, which the seaport has seen a lot of, doesn't automatically lead to equitable spaces. In fact, it tends to result in the opposite. But if approached with a racial equity agenda, we could actually capture some of the value we create for those who stand the most to gain or otherwise the most to lose. I began work with the Massachusetts Port Authority a couple of years ago to develop an inclusive public realm strategy. Massport has always played an important role in welcoming diverse communities into Boston as the port of entry for this melting pot country and melting pot city as they control the airport and the seaport. So this public realm initiative is really about inviting that diversity back into an otherwise homogeneous downtown district, celebrating difference and building more inclusive futures together. Through a combination of short-term tactical programs and longer-term strategic design and policy interventions, pre-development activation has the potential to blur the boundaries between private development and public spaces, transforming soon-to-be sites into platforms for economic and cross-cultural exchange. And the four principles here are diverse cultural representation, inclusive business development, because ownership is key for inclusion, authentic public realm activation, and a commitment to experimentation and testing. The idea is to anchor young creatives from underrepresented neighborhoods with an emphasis on immigrants and communities of color to be artists, designers, small businesses, builders, and activators of the public realm. And so the first step is piloting by introducing temporary and experimental programs on sites prior to their development that will appeal to a wide variety of users. And then the second step is institutionalizing that approach through the existing land disposition process of developer RFPs, requiring developers to allocate a small percentage of their public realm budgetary allocations to inclusive pre-development activation. This does two things. It ensures that the public realm agenda is completely paid for by developers, but more so it provides opportunities for programmatic experimentation during schematic and design development stages of projects, informing more inclusive outcomes on the ground floors of the more permanent formats. And here you can see what that pop-up looks like. This was actually done in the Domino Sugar Factory site in Brooklyn, New York. The artist JR, you can see a large mural of his on this. This was in collaboration with Low Tech, who are container architects, but they're moving into installation art now. And here, really, success is going to come from a fully collaborative cross-sectoral approach to activating the public realm and establishing a strong foundation for social and economic inclusion. Here you can see an idea of activating under-activated sidewalks and the edges along surface parking, providing much needed outdoor space for safe social mixing, but also presenting opportunities to rethink the public realm in new and creative ways and in inclusive ways, particularly. So the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened our need for and use of public parks and outdoor spaces. But as I mentioned earlier, not all parks and public spaces are created equally in size, quality, or programmatic offerings. So who do our public places serve? And who are we designing for? And really, who gets to decide the answers to those questions? The Emerald Necklace Conservancy is developing an equity agenda for their National Olmsted Bicentennial celebration in 2022. And in Boston, I'm working with them on their aim to translate Frederick Law Olmsted's 19th century vision of public open space as urban ecology, the connection of ecology and human activity, public health, an escape from the city for both physical and mental health reasons, and democratic exchange into 21st century interpretations of environmental justice, health equity, and racial justice. The first step was asking how well BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, are being served in and around the Emerald Necklace. Are there targeted strategies, projects, and programs for them? How successful have those been? What are the metrics for success? This map shows the BIPOC, elderly, and youth that live within a 10-minute walk of the Emerald Necklace system. The next step was reviewing existing governance structures, asking who has control, who's making decisions, and do they reflect the lived experiences of those within that area with the most to gain or lose. And here you can see there's a general mismatch between the leadership and those who they are serving in the surrounding communities. So we looked at that information in another way, and we plotted it on this graph. And what you can see are the list of all of the different overseers of the Emerald Necklace Conservancy, the area of interest that they take on based upon their mission or vision statements, and sort of how those interests chart along the path. You can see the neighborhood names in gray. You can see the size of the park system as it goes along in acreages, increases towards Franklin Park. And then you can see in the dark dashed line, the underrepresented population, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and then the light line, children and elderly. And as you can see, there's a major delta in representation in voice, where both you have the largest park offering, but also the largest communities of color, elderly, and children. And so how do we begin to fill this delta in representation so that people actually have the ability to determine their own futures and improve the public spaces which we now rely upon so greatly during COVID? So this is a diagram that shows the organizational structure of the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. So you can see the public sector, the city, the federal, the state, their board and executive committee, the overseers, and then this is a series of task forces that were assembled for this Olmsted Bicentennial to sort of think about how they would run that project. And so one question was how these two governing structures come together, but the other was, why is there no yellow? Why is there no neighborhood representation or voice in almost any of the existing structure or the ad hoc structure which they're creating for the Olmsted Bicentennial? And so right now we're really thinking about this idea of creating a committee of neighborhoods. A committee that is made up of representation from each of the different neighborhoods along the necklace, prioritizing those in neighborhoods that have large concentrations of people of color, children, and elderly. And having that committee really be the committee that makes not only decisions about what happens, but what gets funded. There's a lot of talk about more inclusive processes, but I think once we get to the project being determined and we're talking about how to be more inclusive, it's already too late. We really need people on the inside determining how that money is being spent in the first place. And so here you can see these three diagrams. You know, it's really about moving beyond the traditional boundaries of park space and really understanding the broader implications of open space for communities of color. While the Conservancy and my client are really focused on what's going on inside the space, I'm helping them understand the impacts of what happens on the outside in terms of economic opportunity and employment, affordable housing, mobility and neighborhood connectivity, health and well-being, cultural preservation, and diverse demographics. So for communities of color, a cure for the harm caused by COVID-19 needs to go far beyond developing a vaccine. Reflecting on this country's long history of intentionally racist planning and city building, designers, planners, and policymakers have an ethical obligation to realign our priorities and adopt intentionally anti-racist agendas that address the legacy pockets of inequality in Black and Brown communities. We need social and economic policies that take on the underlying long-standing and persistent problems of structural racism. We need to be redistributing resources, redistributing opportunities, and redistributing power. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I found your talk, as I found Professor Glaeser's, to have a notion of a future that is actually better post-COVID, rather than the one that Professor Forsyth mentioned in her talk of just forgetting. The other thing about your talk represents something that's been characteristic in the course, is the range of related fields that need to be brought together to accomplish change. And I've so often thought that the way we structured the university, we have the School of Design, and we have experts in government and finance, but your talk really drove home this notion that without considering all these things together, the real chances for making change seem much more difficult. And that's actually true of COVID-19 as well, that if we just only address the biomedical problem and we see the vaccine as the solution, then we will have missed, how complicated and difficult it really is to address a pandemic. So greatly appreciative. Now our last speaker will be Dr. Waba, and it's really great to have you here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Brandt and Professor Katz, for having me. I wanted to share with the student a little bit the story from the developing world. And in a sense, I'll be tying through common threads that will touch upon some of the points that Professor Glaeser and Professor Gray have mentioned. So let me tell you first a little bit about the COVID story, and then the urbanization story, and then tie the two together, especially with the view of the city of tomorrow. So a little bit on the COVID story as far as people are concerned. So according to the World Bank, there is an estimated 71 to 100 million people who will fall back into extreme poverty. Now, our mission as an institution is to reduce or practically eliminate extreme poverty, which we measure by getting it to less than 3% by 2030. But I mean, COVID-19 has provided, if you will, a major dent in this regard. Now, the new poor are likely to be more urban. I mean, this is an urban crisis. But strangely enough, poverty has traditionally, extreme poverty has traditionally been more concentrated in rural areas, and there is the story about cities being an escalator out of poverty. However, right now, obviously cities are getting hit. There is an increased level of impoverishment in urban areas, but also traveling back to rural areas, you will have seen, especially in a country like India, a large return of workers who are unemployed in cities back to the villages of origin. And again, the new poor, the new extreme poor are on the whole a bit better educated than, if you will, the existing extreme poor. But at the same time, we also know that within the spectrum of educational backgrounds within a city, it is those with lesser educations that were more likely to lose the jobs, and those living in informal settlements. Now, let me turn to the story of places. Now, not all places were hit in the same way. This slide over here is the city of Seoul. And if we can go to the next slide. And this is the story of a typical informal settlement in many places around the world. Now, not all cities were hit in the same way by COVID-19. We have traditionally been quick to say that density is a culprit. And while obviously all else equal, the more people you put in a given place, all else equal, there'll be more likelihood for viral transmission. But the reality, it's not really about density, it's more about how density is managed. And that echoes very much the studies that Professor Glaeser has mentioned in New York City, that the boroughs with the highest density or those with the least number of cases. So what we know, for instance, is there are two places, for instance, Manhattan and Mumbai, and they have more or less similar population densities, 25,000 persons per square kilometer. But all else equal, in Manhattan, there is 4 times the floor space that exists in Mumbai, which means, again, all else equal, that the person from Mumbai has 1/4 of the built environment in which they're supposed to socially distance that the person in Manhattan does. And of course, we're not even talking about the differences in housing and in public spaces. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the impact, on the whole, cities faced a very severe impact of COVID-19 and its aftermath, especially policies of lockdown. Now, the way we can measure this, is the study of nightlights. This is the city of Wuhan, 2 images of their nightlights, and you can tell the reduced intensity on the right-hand side, and they're 15 days apart. That tells you an example of when lockdowns are imposed, the impact on economic activities. Next slide, please. Now, within the developing world, slums and informal settlements were some of the hardest hit places. So at the World Bank, what we've done is we've done some predictive work using artificial intelligence to try to identify the places that are worst hit and do that quickly so that we can tell mayors where they may want to consider resources. So this is the case of Mumbai. You see data that combines a population density, the built-up environment. We can create 3-dimensional imaging of the city. We also have high-level resolution imagery. And then, next slide, please. And then we collect information about the infrastructure, including public toilets and public water taps, which are places that are naturally hotspots for transmission of the disease. So with that information combined, we can do quick artificial intelligence predictive analytics that identify the hotspots in a city, which are those places where the built environment does not support social distancing. That means that the amount of floor space available relative to the existing population would not allow you to have the 3.4 to 4 square meters per person to socially distance, and then where the infrastructure creates additional hotspots. So this is an example of the analysis of the hotspots in Mumbai. We produced those maps in 2 to 3 weeks, and they point us to the fact that there's over 5 million people who are living in slums and informal settlements in Mumbai that are at risk of increased viral transmission. And as Professor Glaeser has mentioned, there is a strong overlap between the geography of informal settlements and the geography of risk within the developing countries. So what COVID-19 has revealed, it has revealed the inequalities, and it has laid bare those inequalities that exist within cities. And the reality is, slums and informal settlements are a manifestation of the dysfunctions in the functioning of land and housing markets. Because what poor people end up doing as they migrate to the city, they find, and especially when the housing and land market do not function properly, they find themselves with a trade-off between going to live close to where jobs are, close to the city centers, but in those places there aren't much available affordable land, affordable housing, and the only places that they can live in are the unbuildable zones where their lives might be at risk of a landslide, of a flooding, like the slopes on the hills in the favelas in Brazil, like on environmentally contaminated grounds near landfills, on top of landfills, and in flood-prone areas. And this is when poor people take on opportunity at the expense of livability. Of course, their alternative is to go and live where they can find affordable land and housing. These would be at the periphery of cities, which in cities like Johannesburg, Rio, and many others would entail commutes of about 2 to 3 hours per day, which means all else equal 4 to 6 hours of lost productivity. Next slide, please. We know one more fact about the differential commuting patterns between the rich and the poor, and this echoes very much again a point that Professor Glaeser made about commuting patterns within American cities. This is a study of Jakarta, and we've looked at the mobility of various income groups, and what we've noticed is that the mobility of the richest income decile, the top 10% of the income distribution, dropped significantly more than the mobility of the bottom 10% of the income distribution. Basically, in simple terms, the poor cannot afford to stay at home. I mean, they live from hand to mouth, they work in the informal sector for the large part, they cannot afford to stay at home and socially distance, and especially in the absence of social safety nets. Next slide, please. So this is what we've learned from COVID, about the inequalities that exist in cities. And as Professor Glaeser has explained, the story of urbanization is one where you're looking at the benefits of agglomeration, whether it's increased productivity, it's the knowledge spillovers, it's the exchange of ideas, it's the social interaction between people, all the benefits that arise from living in a city, it's access to jobs, increased productivity, versus the costs of urbanization, which is when housing and land markets do not work well, when urbanization has not been planned for properly, you end up with, if you will, the negative externalities, and they're, in the form of congestion, pollution, crime and violence, and of course, as COVID-19 has revealed, epidemics. So when you take that trade-off and you start projecting forward into that city of tomorrow, a few things will start appearing. Next slide, please. The first thing is there will be an important emphasis on revisiting land use planning and zoning regulations. So, obviously slums and informal settlements, the places that were left behind, are going to start, getting much more attention because they have proven to be hotspots of epidemics. Particular facilities such as abattoirs, wet markets, etc. Where do you cite such facilities? What operational safety guidelines are going to operate in order to ensure that zoonotic diseases do not spread? Is going to occupy much more space within planning within cities, public space design parameters, thinking about sidewalks, open spaces, etc. Occupancy, crowding thresholds, and of course planning the peri-urban and rural-urban linkages. Next slide, please. There'll be much more investment that will go into slum upgrading, into ensuring that places that look like this get improvements in the built environment. And these improvements will start with improving tenure security, because what we know is when people do not have secure land tenure, then people would not be willing to invest a penny in improving their housing conditions if they are at risk of eviction and dispossession. So starting by securing land tenure is a way forward to improving slums and informal settlement. Next slide, please. But if we're constantly trying to fix an existing problem, after the problem is created, without trying to proactively, shift away from that problem, then we won't get very far. And that's the story of slums. When we don't invest into, providing access to affordable housing, into creating better living opportunities, then the only option available for the poor is to move into slums, further increasing their density, and then it's much more costly to fix the challenge afterwards. Next slide, please. Rethinking mobility is becoming very important. Many cities have already started increasing, sidewalks. Cities like Auckland, other cities have been putting bicycle lanes, Bogota, Chennai. Other cities have been rethinking also and boosting their public transport systems to make them safer. So rethinking mobility in the context of epidemics is becoming a very important thing. And then these ideas are going forward in certain cities such as Paris and others that are starting to talk about the 15-minute city. Now, the 15-minute city is nothing new. It's the concept, the old planning concept of a neighborhood. And in the neighborhood, you have all your daily needs mostly met there, whether it's the schooling for the children, it's, buying groceries, it's the parks, it's, in certain places, the houses of worships, etc. These availability and the thinking of these within smaller neighborhood units reduces commuting needs throughout the city. And again, the way land use planning is starting to take on these ideas is one of the ways forward. Next slide, please. Thinking also about city preparedness. Cities were caught flat-footed in this crisis, in terms of, how do you create emergency operation centers? How do cities build their own capacity to deal with emergency preparedness and response? We've had that challenge a few years back with cities not being prepared to dealing with disasters, whether it's natural hazards or geohazards like earthquakes, floods, etc. major advances have happened in there, but preparation for dealing with pandemics is something that the majority of the cities around the world were caught flat-footed with, probably with the exception of a few cities in East Asia that have learned from the previous SARS epidemics. Next slide, please. Rethinking supply chains is also becoming an important preoccupation. I mean, especially, cities that were reliant on global supply chains and saw those disruptions. So thinking about, especially in terms of food systems, thinking about proximity, whether it's urban agriculture or peri-urban fringe, and relying on procurement in there. Next slide, please. This one is obviously about the critical need to improve digital infrastructure. So that goes without saying. Next slide, please. And then we get really to the two unknowns. And they echo what Professor Glaeser spoke of, the two tracks corresponding to two different timeframes of dealing with this particular disease. One is, how will people react to density? Obviously, the longer the pandemic, the less forgetting is going to happen. So, and in this case, and obviously the less functional land and housing markets and the more costs of urban density is going to be impacting, certain maybe exits from the city. I personally am of the optimists that are leaning more towards, the story of that the benefits of urban density from agglomeration, from increased productivity, from increased social interactions, knowledge spillovers, etc., definitely do outweigh the costs of urban density. Next slide, please. And that's my last slide before I get into my crystal ball, is the impact on real estate markets and office space. And just yesterday, I received results of a survey that the Urban Land Institute and Ernst & Young did with 555 respondents working in real estate markets between real estate investors, developers, specialized firms, etc. And on the whole, there is a realization that, yes, I mean, telework, the future of work is shifting towards much more remote work. The general impression is, again, this is nothing new. This is a trend that's accelerating. We were more or less at 20% of workers telecommuting maybe 20% of the time. We might be shifting ahead to maybe 50, 60% of workers telecommuting, maybe 40% of the time. So there will be an increase in telecommuting. And as a result of that, there will be adjustments into office space, maybe lesser use and demand on office space in the short term, but over the medium and long term, there will be an evolution or an expected evolution in office space and the demand for commercial real estate, where there'll be much more emphasis on urban regeneration, on demand for office space and downtowns and places where jobs are, that include mixed uses, include more livability. And as Professor Glaeser also mentioned, there'll be an adjustment in prices that will also recalibrate the demand. So again, I don't expect cities to wither away, but more to adapt and to be able to create the conditions on going forward. And this will be my last message to you. The city, as it once stood, was very much a labor market. And I think that notion will need to evolve. The city of tomorrow will be much more a city that be attracting its population on the basis of other considerations. I think livability will be a major factor in drawing people to live and stay and be retained in cities. It'll be about the quality of education, it'll be about the quality of parks, public spaces, cultural amenities, museums, opera houses and what have you, all those amenities that will draw people to stay in cities, especially if they have the ability to be able to working more in remote conditions. And associated with it, it will be the dimension of the inclusive city, because not all jobs will be able to be done remotely. There'll be essential workers that are needed. It's, garbage will need to be collected. You need to have nurses in hospitals. You need to have baristas in cafes. You need to have, all the logistics and food sales industry and supply chains, to provide food into supermarkets, etc. There need to be, policemen and women in the streets, etc. Essential jobs, and the extent to which they're capable of finding affordable housing within a city will also entail the ability of the city to continue delivering on essential services and having that functional dimension. So the city of tomorrow is going to be a livable and inclusive city. And in this way, it will be addressing some of those challenges that COVID-19 laid bare in terms of the inequality within cities. So an optimistic view, and I'll hand it back to Professor Brandt and Professor Katz. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waba, and thank you all to our tremendous speakers today. I think there were so many critical points that you all raised, particularly when we think about our current landscape. Both, I think the theme that you brought up, the idea that it isn't necessarily solely density that's driving contagion, but how density is managed, as you just said, Dr. Waba. And I think that echoes many of the themes that came up today, particularly around equity and justice, the need for community engagement in urban planning, and the fact that, as we've said throughout this course, COVID has laid bare the fundamental inequalities that already existed. They aren't new, they are just being laid bare, but it also provides, as all of you discussed, opportunities to really innovate in this space together if we can seize this moment. And so I think there's hope for the future and our collective resilience. I'm aware that we're right up against the time, but we do have a few student questions. I wonder if we have the ability to stay a few extra minutes to bring in 1 or 2 students. Is that okay with our speakers? Okay, why don't we try to shoot for maybe up to 2 students if possible.